I should have known something was wrong when my own daughter sent me a wedding invitation in the mail instead of calling me. 27 years of raising her, and I get treated like a distant relative who might not even show up. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened at that wedding reception. Nothing could have prepared me for the moment her fiancé would look his business partners in the eye and call me an unretired failure right to my face. Before we go any further, I want you to comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to share with you happened right here in America, in a small town where everyone knows everyone's business. And if you've ever been humiliated by someone you trusted, if you've ever had your life's work dismissed like it meant nothing, then you're going to understand every single word of what I'm about to tell you. My name is Dorothy, but everyone calls me Dot. I'm 71 years old now, and I've lived through things that would break most people. I've buried a husband, raised a daughter as a single mother, and built a business from nothing with these two hands. But none of that prepared me for the betrayal I experienced at what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. It was a Tuesday morning in March when that cream-colored envelope arrived. I recognized my daughter Cassie's handwriting immediately. She's always had that careful, precise way of forming her letters, just like I taught her when she was 7 years old. But when I opened it and saw the formal wedding invitation inside, something cold settled in my stomach. Cassie had been engaged to Trevor Hoffman for 8 months. I'd met him exactly 3 times, and each encounter left me feeling more uneasy than the last. There was something about the way he looked at me, like he was calculating my net worth and finding me wanting. But Cassie was 32 and had been through enough heartbreak that I kept my concerns to myself. I figured if she was happy, that was what mattered. The wedding was set for June 15th at the Riverside Country Club, the most expensive venue in our county. I knew Cassie couldn't afford it on her teacher's salary, and I certainly hadn't been asked to contribute. That should have been my first red flag, but I was so excited about my daughter finally finding love that I pushed my doubts aside. I spent 3 weeks finding the perfect dress. Navy blue with delicate lace sleeves, elegant but not attention-grabbing. I wanted to look like the proud mother of the bride without overshadowing Cassie on her big day. I even got my hair done at that fancy salon downtown, the one where all the country club wives go. Cost me $200, but I figured this was a once-in-a-lifetime occasion. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5:30 with butterflies in my stomach. I'd been dreaming about this day for years, walking my daughter down the aisle, dancing at her reception, watching her start her new life with someone who truly loved her. I had no idea I was about to step into a nightmare that would change everything I thought I knew about my own family. I arrived at the church early, hoping to help Cassie get ready or at least share a quiet moment with her before the ceremony. But when I knocked on the bridal suite door, Trevor's sister Amanda answered with a tight smile. "Oh, hi Mrs. Peterson. Cassie's getting her makeup done right now. Maybe you could come back in an hour." I could hear Cassie laughing inside the room, surrounded by what sounded like a dozen other women. Her bridesmaids, I assumed. None of whom I'd been introduced to, despite asking several times if I could meet them. I spent that hour sitting alone in my car in the church parking lot, watching other wedding guests arrive. Trevor's family and friends pulled up in luxury cars I couldn't even identify. BMW, Mercedes, something that looked like it cost more than my house. They were all dressed in designer clothes, the women dripping with jewelry that caught the sunlight like captured stars. I looked down at my dress from Macy's and suddenly felt like I was wearing a costume to a play I didn't understand. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I'll give them that. Cassie looked radiant in her dress, which I later learned cost $8,000. Trevor's parents had paid for it, along with everything else. As I watched my daughter say her vows, I tried to focus on her happiness and ignore the growing feeling that I was an outsider at my own daughter's wedding. After the ceremony, we all moved to the country club for the reception. The ballroom was decorated with white roses and crystal chandeliers, everything sparkling and perfect. I found my assigned seat at table 12, tucked away in the back corner with some distant relatives I barely knew. The head table, where Cassie and Trevor sat with their wedding party, seemed miles away. I didn't know it yet, but table 12 was going to give me the perfect vantage point to witness my humiliation. Sometimes I wonder if that was intentional too. The first few hours of the reception passed in a blur of polite conversation and awkward small talk. I watched Cassie float around the room in her beautiful dress, accepting congratulations and posing for endless photographs. She looked so happy, so radiant, that I pushed down my growing sense of unease and tried to enjoy the celebration. It was during the cocktail hour, right after the first dance, that everything changed. I was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of white wine and trying to work up the courage to approach Cassie for a mother-daughter photo, when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Trevor was talking to a group of men in expensive suits, their voices low but not quite low enough. They were discussing business, something about a real estate development deal worth millions of dollars. And then I heard Trevor say something that made my knees weak. "Don't worry about the Peterson side of the family. They're nobody. Old money's gone, if there ever was any. Cass's mother is just some unretired failure running a failing small business. She won't be a problem." The men laughed, and one of them clapped Trevor on the back. "Well, as long as you're sure. We can't afford any complications with this project." I stood there frozen, my wine glass shaking in my hand. My daughter's new husband was talking about me like I was some kind of liability, some embarrassment he had to manage. But worse than that, he was clearly using his connection to our family for some kind of business deal. And I had no idea what he was planning. That's when I realized this wedding wasn't just about love. It was about money, power, and something much darker than I could have imagined. And I was about to find out just how far Trevor Hoffman was willing to go to get what he wanted. To understand what happened next, you need to know what Trevor meant when he called me an unretired failure. You need to know about the business I built, the sacrifices I made, and why his words cut so deep they nearly broke me in half. After my husband Frank died in a car accident when Cassie was just 5 years old, I had two choices: crumble or fight. Frank had been our family's breadwinner, working construction and bringing home enough money to keep us comfortable in our little house on Maple Street. When he died, the life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses, and I was left with a mortgage, a kindergartner, and exactly $437 in our checking account. I'd been a stay-at-home mom up until that point, but I'd always been good with numbers and organization. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, suggested I try bookkeeping for some of the small businesses in town. She knew the owner of Peterson's Hardware, no relation, just a coincidence with the name, and thought they might need help with their books. That first job paid me $50 a week to come in after hours and organize their receipts, balance their books, and prepare their monthly reports. Cassie would sit in the corner doing her homework while I worked by the light of a single desk lamp, trying to make sense of showboxes full of crumpled invoices and handwritten notes. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. And more importantly, it was mine. Within 6 months, word had spread around town that Dot Peterson could make sense of any business's finances. I started picking up more clients: the local diner, a small auto repair shop, a family-owned grocery store. Each job taught me something new, and I was hungry to learn everything I could about business operations, tax law, and financial management. By the time Cassie started 2nd grade, I was making enough money to quit my evening cleaning job at the office building downtown. By the time she started 5th grade, I'd saved enough to rent a small office space on Main Street with a sign in the window that read Peterson Financial Services. I'll never forget the day I painted that sign. It was a Saturday morning in October, and Cassie helped me mix the gold paint that would spell out my business name. She was so proud, telling everyone at school that her mom was a business lady now. That little girl had no idea how much those words meant to me. The business grew slowly but steadily. I specialized in helping small, family-owned businesses get their finances in order. I'd work with restaurant owners who kept their receipts in coffee cans, contractors who tracked expenses on the backs of envelopes, shop owners who hadn't balanced a checkbook in years. I'd come in, sort through the chaos, and give them clear, honest assessments of where they stood financially. I wasn't just doing bookkeeping anymore. I was helping people understand their businesses, plan for the future, make smart investments. I was helping families like mine build something that could last. By Cass's high school graduation, Peterson Financial Services had 12 regular clients and a reputation for integrity that stretched across 3 counties. I'd put Cassie through private school, saved enough money to send her to college, and even managed to pay off the mortgage on our little house 5 years early. But I never got rich. I never drove luxury cars or vacationed in Europe or wore designer clothes. Every penny I made went back into the business or into securing Cass's future. I lived modestly because I'd learned the hard way that financial security was more important than financial flash. When Cassie graduated from college with her teaching degree, she came home and told me she was proud of what I'd built. She said watching me work so hard to support our family had taught her the value of independence and determination. I thought I'd raised her to understand that success wasn't measured in dollar signs or status symbols, but in the lives you touched and the legacy you left behind. I was wrong about that too. The business hit some rough patches in recent years, I'll admit that. The 2020 pandemic nearly destroyed half my client base. Small businesses were closing left and right, and the ones that survived were cutting every expense they could, including professional services like mine. I watched families lose businesses they'd built over decades, watched dreams crumble faster than I could help put them back together. I had to let go of my office space and work from home. I had to reduce my fees just to keep my remaining clients afloat. There were months when I wasn't sure I'd be able to pay my own bills, let alone help anyone else with theirs. But I survived. I adapted. I learned new software, took online courses in digital marketing and e-commerce, helped my clients navigate the maze of government relief programs and new tax laws. By 2023, I was back on solid ground with 8 steady clients and a growing reputation for helping businesses transition to modern financial management systems. I wasn't failing. I wasn't some washed-up old woman who didn't understand the modern world. I was evolving, just like I'd been doing for over 30 years. And I was proud of that evolution. So when Trevor Hoffman stood in that country club ballroom and dismissed my life's work as the efforts of an unretired failure, he wasn't just insulting me. He was insulting every family I'd helped save their business, every dream I'd helped make possible, every late night I'd spent making sure someone else's numbers added up so they could sleep peacefully. He was insulting the woman who'd sacrificed her own comfort to give his new wife every opportunity in the world. But here's what Trevor didn't know about me. I'd been keeping books for over 30 years, and I'd learned to notice when numbers didn't add up. I'd learned to spot inconsistencies, follow paper trails, and ask the right questions when something seemed off. And everything about Trevor Hoffman's lifestyle, his family's wealth, and his casual dismissal of my failing small business was setting off every alarm bell I'd developed in 3 decades of financial detective work. If he wanted to play games with numbers, he'd picked the wrong woman to underestimate. The weeks following the wedding were a masterclass in how quickly your whole world can shift when you start paying attention to details you'd previously ignored. And trust me, after 30 years of combing through other people's financial records, I'd learned that the devil, and the truth, are always in the details. Cassie and Trevor moved into a stunning colonial house in Westfield Estates, the kind of neighborhood where the driveways are longer than some people's entire properties. When Cassie gave me the grand tour 2 weeks after their honeymoon, I couldn't help but do what I always do, calculate the numbers in my head. The house had to be worth at least $800,000. The furniture looked like it came straight from a high-end designer showroom. The kitchen appliances were top-of-the-line Sub-Zero and Wolf brands. I knew because I'd helped a restaurant client price similar equipment. Even the landscaping looked like it cost more than most people's annual salaries. Cassie was glowing as she showed me around, talking about their plans to start a family soon, maybe put in a swimming pool next summer. She seemed genuinely happy, but there was something different about her too. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Trevor's been so generous, she kept saying. He insists on paying for everything. He says he wants me to focus on my students and not worry about money. That should have sounded romantic. Instead, it made my stomach clench with worry. I'd raised Cassie to be independent, to never rely on anyone else for her financial security. Those were lessons learned from my own experience after Frank died. But here she was, completely dependent on a man she'd known for barely over a year, living in a house she couldn't afford on her teacher's salary, surrounded by luxury she'd never expressed interest in before. What exactly does Trevor do for work? I asked as we sat in her pristine living room, sipping coffee from cups that probably cost more than I'd spent on dishes in my entire lifetime. He's in real estate development, Cassie said, but her answer was vague, like she was reciting something she'd memorized rather than understood. He works with investors to develop commercial properties. Shopping centers, office buildings, that sort of thing. And that pays enough for all this. I gestured around the opulent room. Cassie's smile tightened slightly. Mom, Trevor comes from money. His family has been in real estate for generations. He's not like the guys I dated before. He's established, successful. He can provide for us. There it was. That word, provide. Like she was some delicate flower who needed someone else to take care of her, rather than the strong, independent woman I'd raised her to be. I started doing what I do best, investigating. It began innocently enough. I looked up Trevor's company online, Hoffman Development Group. The website was sleek and professional, full of glossy photos of impressive buildings and testimonials from satisfied clients. Trevor was listed as Senior Vice President, working alongside his father, Richard Hoffman, who served as CEO. But something about the website bothered me. The projects they showcased were all generic stock photos, the kind you could buy from any photography website. The testimonials were attributed to companies I'd never heard of, despite working with businesses across 3 counties for over 30 years. I dug deeper. The Hoffman Development Group was registered as an LLC in Delaware, which made it nearly impossible to trace their actual financial records. But their business address was a P.O. box in a strip mall 40 miles away, not the prestigious downtown office building shown in their promotional materials. I called the county recorder's office and asked about recent commercial developments in the area. The clerk, a sweet woman named Janet who'd been there for decades, was happy to chat. Hoffman Development Group, she repeated when I asked. That name doesn't sound familiar. Let me check our records. No, I don't see any major projects under that name in the past 5 years. Are you sure you have the right company name? That's when the first cracks in Trevor's perfect facade started to show. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly investigating, using all the skills I developed tracking down financial discrepancies for my clients. I checked property records, business registrations, even social media profiles. The more I looked, the more questions I had. Trevor's LinkedIn profile claimed he'd graduated from Wharton Business School, but when I called the alumni office pretending to be organizing a class reunion, they had no record of a Trevor Hoffman graduating in the year he'd listed. His Instagram was full of photos of luxury vacations and expensive restaurants, but many of the images looked staged, like stock photos with Trevor inserted into them. The locations didn't match the timestamps, and several photos claimed to be taken on dates when I knew he'd been in town. Most concerning of all, I couldn't find any record of actual real estate deals or property sales involving Hoffman Development Group. For a company that claimed to have been developing commercial properties for 3 generations, they seemed to have left remarkably few traces of their work. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to investigate Trevor's family background. I drove to the library in the next county over, where they kept archived copies of all the local newspapers going back 50 years. If the Hoffman family had really been prominent local real estate developers for generations, there should be plenty of coverage of their projects, social events, community involvement. I spent an entire Saturday scrolling through decades of newspaper archives. I found plenty of references to various Hoffmans over the years. It's a common enough name, but none that matched the story Trevor had told Cassie about his family's business empire. What I did find, buried in a small business news section from 2019, was a brief mention of a Richard Hoffman being investigated by the State Attorney General's office for potential securities fraud related to a failed real estate investment scheme. The charges were apparently dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the mention was there in black and white. I made a copy of that article and tucked it into my purse, my hands shaking slightly as I realized what I might be uncovering. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to decide what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to march over to Cass's house and confront them both immediately, but I knew my daughter well enough to know that approach would only make her defensive. Besides, I was starting to suspect that whatever Trevor was involved in went deeper than just lying about his credentials. The conversation I'd overheard at the wedding was starting to make more sense. Old money's gone, if there ever was any. She won't be a problem. Trevor wasn't just dismissing my business success. He was planning something that involved my family's financial situation, and he saw me as a potential obstacle to his plans. I decided to keep digging. But this time, I was going to be more careful about it. Because if Trevor Hoffman thought he could use my daughter to get whatever he was after, he was about to learn that this unretired failure still had a few tricks up her sleeve. If you've made it this far in my story, please hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you gets darker than anything I could have imagined. And if you're someone who's ever had a gut feeling that something wasn't right about a situation, you'll understand why I couldn't just let this go. The first concrete evidence of Trevor's real plan came wrapped in wedding gift paper and tied with a silver bow. About 6 weeks after the wedding, Cassie called me, sounding more excited than I'd heard her in months. "Mom, you're never going to believe this. Trevor surprised me with the most incredible wedding gift. He's giving you a business opportunity that could change everything." My blood turned to ice water. In 30 years of running my own business, I'd learned that when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. And when someone who'd publicly called you an unretired failure suddenly offers you a business opportunity, you'd better start looking for the trap. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "He wants to invest in Peterson Financial Services. He said he's been watching how hard you work and how much your clients respect you, and he thinks with the right backing, you could expand into a full-service financial consulting firm. Isn't that amazing? No, I wanted to say. It's terrifying. He wants to meet with you next week to discuss the details, Cassie continued. He's talking about providing startup capital, maybe helping you get some bigger corporate clients. Mom, this could be your chance to really make it big. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the same table where I'd done homework with Cassie 25 years earlier, where I'd spread out my first client's receipts and taught myself bookkeeping by trial and error. This little house, this modest life, this small but honest business, it had been enough for me. It had been more than enough. So why was Trevor suddenly interested in investing in something he dismissed as a failing small business just weeks earlier? The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at Trevor's supposed office downtown. I spent the intervening days doing more research, but this time I focused on a different angle: investment fraud schemes targeting small business owners. What I found made my skin crawl. There were dozens of documented cases of con artists who would identify successful small businesses with aging owners, then offer investment opportunities that were actually elaborate schemes to gain control of the business assets, drain the accounts, and disappear. Often, they'd use romantic connections, marrying into the family, befriending the owner's children, to build trust and get access to sensitive financial information. The playbook was always the same: identify the target, build the relationship, offer the investment, gain access to accounts and records, then systematically empty everything of value while maintaining the facade until it was too late. I printed out 3 different case studies and read them until I could recite them from memory. In every single case, the victims had trusted someone they thought was family. Thursday morning, I got up early and dressed in my best business suit, the navy blue one I'd bought for client meetings back when I could afford such luxuries. I wanted to look professional, competent, not like someone who could be easily fooled. Trevor's supposed office was in a glass building downtown that I'd driven past hundreds of times over the years. The lobby directory listed Hoffman Development Group on the 7th floor, Suite 712. When I got off the elevator, Suite 712 turned out to be a small, sparsely furnished space with generic furniture and no personal touches. It looked like the kind of office you'd rent by the month when you needed a professional address but didn't actually conduct any real business there. Trevor was waiting for me, dressed in an expensive suit and flashing that charming smile that had apparently fooled my daughter completely. He offered me coffee, asked about my drive downtown, made small talk like we were old friends instead of reluctant in-laws. "I'm so glad you could make it, Dorothy. I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since the wedding." "I'll bet you have," I thought. "Cassie tells me you want to invest in my business," I said, cutting straight to the point. "I have to say, I'm surprised. At the wedding, you seem to have a different opinion of Peterson Financial Services." For just a split second, his smile faltered. But he recovered quickly. "I think there might have been a misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "I have nothing but respect for what you've built. That's exactly why I see so much potential for growth." He spread out a folder of documents on his desk, glossy presentations showing financial projections, expansion plans, organizational charts. It all looked very professional, very convincing. The kind of materials that would make most small business owners salivate at the possibilities. With the right capital injection, Trevor explained, we could expand Peterson Financial Services into a full-service consulting firm. We're talking about moving into corporate accounts, government contracts, maybe even franchise opportunities. I'm prepared to invest $200,000 to get started. $200,000. More money than I'd ever seen in one place in my entire life. "That's very generous," I said carefully. "What exactly would you want in return?" "Nothing unreasonable. I'd want to be listed as a business partner, of course. And I'd need access to your client files and financial records to conduct due diligence on the expansion opportunities. Standard business practice." There it was. The trap hidden in the pretty wrapping paper. He wanted access to my client files, files that contained sensitive financial information for some of the most successful small businesses in 3 counties. Files that would show him exactly which companies had cash reserves, which ones were struggling, which ones might be vulnerable to his next scheme. He wasn't investing in my business. He was buying a roadmap to every potential victim in the region. "I'd need some time to think about this," I said, gathering up the documents he'd given me. "This is a big decision." Of course. But Dorothy." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more serious tone. I hope you understand what an opportunity this is. At your age, with the challenges facing small businesses these days, well, let's just say this might be your last chance to really secure your financial future. At my age. There it was again, that dismissive tone barely hidden under a veneer of false concern. I stood up, tucked the folder under my arm, and looked him straight in the eye. Trevor, I've been securing my own financial future for over 30 years. I think I can manage a little while longer. His smile turned cold. I hope so, Dorothy. I really do. Because it would be a shame if something happened to jeopardize the business you've worked so hard to build. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. And that's when I knew for certain that my daughter had married a predator. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I made two decisions. First, I was going to find out exactly what Trevor Hoffman was planning, and I was going to stop him. And second, I was going to make sure he learned exactly what kind of woman he was dealing with when he decided to threaten Dorothy Peterson. He thought I was just some unretired failure he could manipulate and intimidate. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. The thing about being in the financial services business for 30 years is that you develop certain instincts. You learn to read between the lines of balance sheets, to spot the discrepancies that others miss, to follow paper trails that lead to the truth. And when someone threatens your life's work, you don't just get mad, you get methodical. I spent the next 2 weeks conducting the most thorough investigation of my career. Not for a paying client this time, but for my own survival and my daughter's future. I started with the documents Trevor had given me. On the surface, they looked legitimate: professional layouts, impressive financial projections, detailed expansion plans. But when I looked closer, using the same scrutiny I'd applied to suspicious client records over the years, the cracks started to show. The financial projections were based on market research from outdated sources. The expansion timeline was unrealistic for a business my size. Most telling of all, the proposed partnership agreement was heavily weighted in Trevor's favor, giving him control over business decisions, access to all financial records, and a majority stake after just 6 months. It wasn't an investment offer. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a wedding gift. But that was just the beginning. I decided to dig deeper into Trevor's background, and this time I wasn't relying on internet searches and public records. I was going to use every contact I'd built up in 3 decades of business to find out who Trevor Hoffman really was. My first call was to Linda Reeves, who ran the credit bureau that most of my small business clients used. Linda and I had worked together for 15 years, and she owed me a few favors from times I'd helped her navigate tricky client situations. You know I'm not supposed to run personal credit checks without proper authorization, she said when I explained what I needed. Linda, my daughter just married this man, and something doesn't feel right. I'm not asking you to break any laws, but if there's anything in the public record that I should know about. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, give me his full name and date of birth. I'll see what I can find through legitimate channels. 2 days later, Linda called me back with information that made my blood run cold. Trevor Hoffman had filed for bankruptcy twice in the past 10 years. He defaulted on multiple business loans, had several credit cards charged off as uncollectible debt, and was currently involved in 2 civil lawsuits related to unpaid contractor fees. This guy's financial history is a disaster, Linda told me. I don't know how he's maintaining his current lifestyle, but it's not through legitimate income. His credit score is so low that he couldn't qualify for a gas station credit card, let alone finance the kind of house and cars you're describing. That explained the expensive lifestyle funded by mysterious means. Trevor wasn't successful. He was surviving by continuously finding new sources of money to pay off old debts. And my daughter, with her stable teaching job and connection to my business client network, represented his next target. But I needed more than just credit reports. I needed to understand the full scope of what Trevor was planning. My next call was to Marcus Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, who'd grown up to become a private investigator after retiring from the police force. Marcus had helped me with several cases over the years where clients suspected employee theft or vendor fraud. Marcus, I need a favor, and I need you to be discreet about it, I said when he answered the phone. My daughter's husband might be running some kind of con, and I need to know what I'm dealing with. Marcus agreed to do some quiet investigating into Trevor's business activities and personal associations. What he found over the next week was worse than I'd imagined. Trevor wasn't just financially unstable, He was part of a larger network of individuals who specialized in investment fraud schemes targeting older adults and small business owners. Marcus had traced connections between Trevor and at least 3 other men who'd been investigated for similar schemes in neighboring states. The pattern's always the same, Marcus explained when he met me at the diner downtown to share his findings. They identify targets through social connections, church groups, community organizations, family relationships. They build trust over months or even years, then offer investment opportunities that sound legitimate but are actually ways to drain assets and disappear. How much money are we talking about? I asked. From what I can piece together, this group has stolen over $2 million from victims across 4 states in the past 3 years. They're sophisticated. They use real business addresses, create fake websites, even plant false testimonials online. Most victims don't realize they've been conned until months after the money's gone. My hands were shaking as I lifted my coffee cup. And they think I'm their next target. Not just you. Your entire client network. Think about it. You have detailed financial records for dozens of successful small businesses. You know which ones have cash reserves, which ones are family-owned and might be vulnerable to smooth-talking investment advisors, which ones are run by older owners who might be approaching retirement. The full scope of Trevor's plan was becoming clear. He didn't just want to steal my business, he wanted to use it as a launching pad to systematically defraud every client I'd worked with for the past 30 years. All those families who'd trusted me with their most sensitive financial information. All those small business owners who'd built something meaningful over decades of hard work. Trevor saw them as nothing more than a catalogue of potential victims, and he thought marrying my daughter would give him access to that catalogue. There's something else, Marcus said, his voice dropping lower. I think Trevor might have done this before. I found records of a similar marriage in Ohio 3 years ago. A woman named Patricia Brennan, widow, owned a small accounting firm. She died in a car accident 6 months after her daughter married a man matching Trevor's description. The daughter inherited the business, but it was liquidated within a year, and both the daughter and son-in-law disappeared. I felt like I was going to be sick. You think he killed her? I can't prove anything, but the timing's suspicious. And Patricia Brennan was 73 years old. She drove the same route to work every day for 20 years, never had an accident in her life. Then one rainy Tuesday, she somehow lost control of her car and hit a tree at 60 miles per hour. I sat there in that diner booth, staring at my untouched piece of pie, trying to process what Marcus was telling me. Trevor hadn't just married my daughter for access to my business. He'd married her because I was supposed to be his next victim, and after he'd drained everything I'd built, I was supposed to die in an accident that would leave Cassie as the sole beneficiary of my estate. What do I do? I whispered. Marcus leaned forward. First, you don't let on that you know any of this. If Trevor suspects you're onto him, he might accelerate his timeline or, well, we don't want to find out what else he might do. Second, we need to gather enough evidence to take to the authorities. And third, you need to protect yourself and your daughter. I thought about Cassie, so happy in her new house, talking about starting a family with Trevor. She had no idea she'd married a man who'd killed before and was planning to kill again. That night, I went home and sat in my kitchen, looking around at the modest house where I'd raised my daughter, where I'd built my business from nothing, where I'd thought I'd live out my golden years in peace. Trevor Hoffman had picked the wrong woman to underestimate. He thought I was some helpless old lady who'd hand over everything I'd worked for without a fight. But I'd survived losing my husband at 35, raised a daughter as a single mother, and built a business that had weathered every economic storm for 3 decades. I'd outmaneuvered competitors, outlasted recessions, and outsmarted con artists who thought they could take advantage of a widow. Trevor had made one critical mistake in his calculations. He'd assumed that calling me an unretired failure would break my spirit and make me desperate enough to accept his poisoned offer. Instead, he'd just declared war on a woman who'd been fighting battles he couldn't even imagine since before he was born. And this time, I wasn't just fighting for my business or my financial future. I was fighting for my daughter's life. Now, if you've been following along and feeling that pit in your stomach grow deeper with each revelation, you're going to want to share this story with someone you care about. Because what happened next at that country club reception shows just how quickly a predator will reveal their true nature when they think they have you trapped. I need to take you back to that moment at the wedding reception, because understanding what led up to Trevor's public humiliation of me is crucial to understanding why my revenge had to be so complete, so devastating, and so perfectly calculated. It was about 2 hours into the reception. I'd been nursing my second glass of wine and trying to work up the courage to approach Cassie for that mother-daughter photo I'd been hoping for all day. She looked so radiant in her wedding dress, spinning around the dance floor with Trevor, laughing at something he'd whispered in her ear. But every time I started to walk toward them, one of Trevor's family members or friends would intercept me with polite but dismissive small talk that made it clear I wasn't really welcome in their circle. I was standing near the bar, feeling increasingly isolated at my own daughter's wedding, when I noticed Trevor leave the dance floor and walk over to a group of men in expensive suits who'd been drinking heavily near the far end of the ballroom. Something about their body language caught my attention. These weren't wedding guests making casual conversation. This was business being conducted, serious business that required privacy and discretion. I moved closer, pretending to admire the flower arrangements on a nearby table, and that's when I heard Trevor's voice rise just slightly above the background music. "The old lady's business is exactly what we need," he was saying to the group. 30 years of client files, established relationships with every small business worth targeting in 3 counties. She's got access to financial records that would take us months to compile on our own. One of the men, tall with graying hair and a face that looked like it had never smiled at anything that wasn't profitable, nodded approvingly. "And you're sure she'll cooperate?" Trevor's laugh was cold, calculating. "She doesn't have a choice. Her business is hanging on by a thread. Pandemic nearly killed her. She's operating out of her house now, down to maybe 8 clients. She's desperate, and desperate people make stupid decisions." "What about the daughter?" another man asked. "She could be a problem if things go sideways." "Cassie." Trevor's voice took on that dismissive tone I was beginning to recognize. "She's an elementary school teacher making $35,000 a year. She's never had money, never had power, never had options. She's so grateful to be rescued from her pathetic little life that she'd believe anything I tell her." The men laughed, and I felt something inside me start to crack. But Trevor wasn't done. "Besides, if Dot becomes a problem, there are ways to handle that too. Patricia Brennan thought she was smarter than us, right up until she had that unfortunate accident." My blood turned to ice. Marcus had been right. Trevor hadn't just planned similar schemes, he'd killed to cover his tracks. "So what's the timeline?" the tall man asked. "I'm meeting with Dot next week to present the investment opportunity. Once she signs over access to her files and accounts, we'll have everything we need to move on the primary targets. I figure 6 months to liquidate the major assets, then we relocate to the next territory." "And if she doesn't sign?" Trevor's smile was the most chilling thing I'd ever seen. "Then Cassie becomes a very young, very wealthy widow with a business she can't possibly manage on her own." I stood there frozen, my wine glass shaking in my hand, listening to my daughter's new husband plan my murder at her wedding reception. But the worst part, the part that still makes me wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, was what happened next. Trevor must have sensed someone listening, because he turned around and saw me standing there. For just a split second, his mask slipped completely, and I saw the cold, calculating predator behind the charming smile. Then he recovered, walked over to me with his arms spread wide like we were old friends. "Dorothy. Perfect timing. I was just telling my business partners about you." The men followed him over, and I found myself surrounded by the group that had been discussing my murder like it was a routine business transaction. "Gentlemen," Trevor said, his voice loud enough for nearby wedding guests to hear, "I'd like you to meet my new mother-in-law, Dorothy Peterson." The men looked at me with barely concealed contempt, like I was some kind of amusing novelty. "Dorothy runs a small financial services business," Trevor continued, and I could hear the mockery creeping into his voice. "Well, runs might be too generous a term. Let's just say she's an unretired failure who's been trying to keep her little operation afloat despite having no real understanding of modern business practices." The men smiled, understanding that they were watching Trevor demonstrate his dominance over his next victim. But Trevor wasn't finished humiliating me in front of his criminal associates. "Dorothy here has been working out of her kitchen for the past few years," he said, his voice growing louder and more cutting. "Can you imagine? A 70-year-old woman still pretending she can compete in today's market. It would be sad if it weren't so pathetic." The tall man with the gray hair looked me up and down like I was livestock being evaluated for slaughter. "Well, Trevor, we all have family obligations. I'm sure Dorothy does her best with her limitations." "Oh, she certainly tries," Trevor said. "Don't you, Dorothy? Still plugging away with your little calculator and your handwritten ledgers, trying to convince yourself that you're running a real business instead of just a hobby that's gotten out of hand. I felt the blood drain from my face. Around us, other wedding guests were starting to notice the conversation, some of them looking uncomfortable with Trevor's tone. But he wasn't done. The thing is, Dorothy, at some point you have to face reality. You're past retirement age, your business is failing, and you're in way over your head trying to keep up with modern financial services. Maybe it's time to consider that investment opportunity we discussed, before you lose what little you have left. And then he smiled that charming smile and delivered the final blow. After all, we can't have Cass's mother embarrassing the family with her amateur operation, can we? The men laughed again, and one of them, a younger man with dead eyes and manicured fingernails, looked directly at me and said the words that would haunt me for months to come. Trevor, if she can't adapt to the modern business world, maybe she shouldn't be in business at all. Some people just don't know when to quit. Another man, older with a pot belly and expensive watch, nodded in agreement. Exactly. And Trevor, we appreciate you keeping us informed about any potential complications. It's better to know about these things in advance. The threat was clear to anyone who understood the language these men spoke. I wasn't just being dismissed as an unretired failure. I was being marked for elimination. I stood there in my navy blue dress with the delicate lace sleeves, surrounded by men who were planning to destroy everything I'd built and then kill me to cover their tracks, at my own daughter's wedding reception. In that moment, something inside me shattered completely. Not my spirit, that was stronger than ever. What shattered was any remaining illusion that this could be resolved quietly, diplomatically, or through normal channels. These men saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. They'd already killed at least once to protect their schemes, and they were planning to kill again. But they'd made one critical error in their calculations. They assumed that calling me an unretired failure would break me down and make me easy to manipulate. Instead, they'd just shown me exactly what I was dealing with and exactly how far I'd need to go to protect my daughter and myself. As I walked away from that group, my legs shaking but my resolve hardening into something unbreakable, I realized that Trevor Hoffman had just declared war on the wrong woman. He wanted to see what this unretired failure was capable of. He was about to find out. The week after Trevor's public humiliation of me at the wedding reception, I did something I hadn't done in over 30 years of running my business. I lied to a client. Mrs. Patterson, who owned the bakery downtown and had been one of my most loyal clients for 15 years, called to ask about setting up a retirement account. Instead of giving her my usual honest assessment of her financial situation, I told her I was too busy with new clients to take on any additional work. I hated lying to her. Mrs. Patterson had trusted me with her business finances since she was a young mother trying to make her bakery profitable enough to support her family. But I couldn't risk involving her in what was about to unfold. Because I was about to turn Peterson Financial Services into bait for the most elaborate trap I'd ever constructed. The plan that took shape in my mind over those sleepless nights was born from everything I'd learned in 30 years of untangling other people's financial messes. I knew how con artists operated, how they identified victims, how they gained trust, and most importantly, how they covered their tracks. But I also knew something Trevor and his associates didn't expect me to know: how to create a paper trail that would lead them exactly where I wanted them to go. I started by setting up what looked like the perfect target for their scheme. I opened a new business account at a different bank, one where Trevor's contacts wouldn't think to look immediately. Into this account, I deposited every penny I'd saved over the past 5 years. My emergency fund, my retirement savings, even the money I'd been setting aside to help Cassie buy her first house someday. $43,000. Not a fortune by Trevor's standards, but enough to look like a desperate woman's life savings. Next, I created fake financial records showing that Peterson Financial Services was in much better shape than Trevor believed. I generated client contracts for businesses that didn't exist, invoice payments from fictional companies, even bank statements showing steady income from imaginary accounts. To anyone conducting superficial due diligence, it would look like I'd been lying about my financial struggles, hiding assets and income that made me a much more valuable target than they'd initially thought. But here's where my 30 years of experience with financial fraud investigations paid off. I embedded subtle inconsistencies in every fake document. Account numbers that didn't match proper banking formats. Invoice dates that fell on weekends when businesses would be closed. Client payments that didn't correspond to actual business cycles. Any legitimate investor would spot these red flags immediately and walk away. But con artists aren't legitimate investors, they're predators looking for easy prey, and predators tend to see what they want to see rather than what's actually there. While I was building the financial facade, I was also gathering evidence through my network of business contacts. Linda at the credit bureau provided me with additional background information on Trevor's associates. Marcus continued his private investigation, tracing the connections between Trevor's group and similar frauds in other states. Most importantly, I convinced my friend Janet at the county recorder's office to help me set up surveillance of any attempts to research property records related to my home or business. If Trevor's group was planning to target me for asset seizure or worse, they'd need to know exactly what I owned and where it was located. I don't like the sound of this, Janet said when I explained what I needed. These people sound dangerous. Maybe you should just go to the police. And tell them what? That I overheard a conversation at a wedding reception? That I suspect my daughter's husband might be planning to defraud me? They'd need evidence, Janet, and right now all I have are suspicions and circumstantial connections. But if something happens to you? Nothing's going to happen to me, I said firmly. Because I'm not going to be the victim in this story. But I need to know when they start researching my assets, because that's when I'll know they're taking the bait. The most difficult part of setting up the trap was deciding what to tell Cassie. I couldn't reveal everything I'd learned about Trevor without putting her in danger, but I also couldn't let her remain completely in the dark about what was happening. I settled on a partial truth. When Cassie called to ask if I'd made a decision about Trevor's investment offer, I told her I was considering it but wanted to do some additional research first. I'm thinking about having someone look into the legal aspects of the partnership agreement, I said. You know how careful I am about business contracts. Mom, Trevor's been so patient about this, Cassie said, and I could hear the tension in her voice. His partners are really excited about the opportunity, and I think they're starting to wonder if you're actually serious about expanding the business. His partners. The same men who'd stood around discussing my murder like it was a quarterly budget meeting. Tell Trevor I'll have an answer for him by Friday, I said. I just want to make sure I understand all the implications before I sign anything. Okay, but Mom, please don't take too long. Trevor says opportunities like this don't come around very often, especially for someone in your situation. Someone in my situation. Another reminder that my own daughter now saw me through Trevor's eyes, as a failing old woman who should be grateful for any lifeline thrown her way. That conversation strengthened my resolve. Trevor hadn't just targeted me for financial fraud and possible murder. He'd poisoned my relationship with my daughter, turning her into an unwitting accomplice in my destruction. By Thursday night, all the pieces were in place. The fake financial records were perfect, the bait account was funded, and my network of allies was ready to document every step of Trevor's scheme. I called Trevor's office and left a message that I was ready to move forward with his investment proposal. I've reviewed everything, I said into his voicemail, and I think you're right about the expansion potential. I'd like to schedule a meeting to sign the paperwork and discuss the next steps. When he called me back an hour later, I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. I'm so glad you've decided to be reasonable about this, Dorothy. I think you'll find this partnership very rewarding. I hope so, I said, playing the part of the grateful, slightly desperate old woman he expected me to be. When can we meet? How about Monday morning? I'll have all the contracts ready, and we can get the financial transfers started immediately. Financial transfers. The moment when they'd gain access to my real accounts and discover I wasn't quite as helpless as they'd assumed. That sounds perfect, I said. Oh, and Trevor, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I know I'm not the most sophisticated businesswoman, but I promise I won't let you down. His laugh was cold and satisfied. Don't worry, Dorothy. I'm sure everything will work out exactly as planned. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, looking around at the same modest surroundings where I'd built my life and raised my daughter. By this time next week, Trevor and his associates would discover that this unretired failure had just led them into the most comprehensive trap they'd ever encountered. But first, I had one more call to make. Marcus, I said when the private investigator answered, it's time. They're ready to make their move, which means we need to be ready to make ours. Are you sure about this, Dot? Once we start recording their meetings and documenting their actions, there's no going back. If they suspect you're onto them before we have enough evidence, They won't suspect anything, I said. Because they think they're dealing with some helpless old woman who's too scared and desperate to cause any trouble. And if you're wrong? I thought about Patricia Brennan, the widow in Ohio who tried to be smarter than Trevor's group. I thought about Cassie, so trusting and happy in her new marriage. I thought about all the small business owners whose life savings Trevor was planning to steal. Then I guess they'll find out what happens when you underestimate a woman who spent 30 years learning how to fight battles they can't even imagine. Monday couldn't come fast enough. Monday morning arrived grey and cold, with the kind of drizzle that makes everything look bleak and uncertain. I dressed carefully in my best business suit again, but this time I had more than just professional appearance in mind. Hidden in my jacket pocket was a digital recording device that Marcus had given me, no bigger than a pack of gum but capable of capturing every word of what I knew would be Trevor's confession. I arrived at his fake office building 15 minutes early and used the time to test the recording equipment and review my strategy one final time. Everything depended on getting Trevor and his associates to reveal enough details about their scheme to build a solid criminal case. But I also knew that if they suspected I was recording them, this meeting could end very differently than I'd planned. Trevor was waiting for me in Suite 712, along with two of the men I recognized from the wedding reception, the tall one with grey hair and the younger one with the dead eyes. They introduced themselves as Richard Sterling and Michael Voss, supposedly Trevor's senior business partners. "Dorothy, thank you so much for coming in today," Trevor said, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. "I think you're going to be very pleased with what we've put together for you." The contracts they spread out in front of me were even worse than I'd expected. The partnership agreement would give Trevor's group immediate access to all my business accounts, client files, and financial records. Within 6 months, they'd have complete control over Peterson Financial Services, with me relegated to a junior consultant role at a fraction of my current income. But hidden in the fine print were clauses that would allow them to terminate the partnership at any time, keeping all assets and leaving me with nothing but potential liability for any business debts they chose to assign to my name. It wasn't just a hostile takeover. It was a complete destruction of everything I'd built, designed to leave me financially ruined and legally vulnerable. "This looks very comprehensive," I said, playing the part of the impressed but slightly overwhelmed business owner. "I have to admit, some of these legal terms are beyond me. Could you walk me through exactly how this would work?" That's when they made their first mistake. Instead of keeping their explanations vague and general, they started getting specific about their real intentions. "The beauty of this arrangement," Richard Sterling explained, "is that we'll have access to your established client relationships immediately. Many of your clients are exactly the type of small business owners who could benefit from our specialized investment services." "What kind of investment services?" I asked. Michael Voss leaned forward, his dead eyes fixed on my face. "High-yield opportunities that aren't available to the general public. Commercial real estate developments, private equity partnerships, that sort of thing. The kind of investments that can turn a small family business into a real wealth-building enterprise." I knew exactly what kind of investments they were describing. The same fictitious opportunities they'd been using to defraud victims across multiple states. "That sounds exciting," I said. "Have you had success with similar partnerships before?" "Oh yes," Trevor said, his voice taking on a boastful tone. "We've helped dozens of business owners transition from small-scale operations to serious wealth accumulation. Richard, didn't we work with that accounting firm in Ohio last year?" Richard Sterling's expression tightened slightly. "Trevor, I don't think we need to get into specific examples." But Trevor was too caught up in demonstrating his sophistication to his unsophisticated victim. "Patricia Brennan," he continued, ignoring his partner's warning look. "Sweet old lady, very similar situation to yours, Dorothy. Small accounting practice, aging client base, worried about retirement security. We helped her restructure her entire business model." "What happened to her?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Unfortunately, Patricia had some personal issues that interfered with the partnership," Michael Voss said smoothly. "Sometimes older business owners have trouble adapting to new approaches." "She died in a car accident," Trevor added bluntly. "Very tragic. But her daughter inherited a much more valuable business than Patricia could ever have built on her own." The casual way he mentioned Patricia Brennan's death, like it was just an unfortunate inconvenience rather than murder, made my blood run cold. But it also gave me exactly the kind of evidence I needed. "Well, I certainly hope nothing like that happens to me, I said with a nervous laugh. Of course not, Richard Sterling said quickly, shooting another warning look at Trevor. We're very careful about selecting partners who are ready to embrace new opportunities. Speaking of which, Trevor said, pushing the contracts toward me, we should probably get these signed so we can start moving forward. My partners have already identified several of your clients who would be perfect candidates for our investment programs. Which clients? I asked. Well, Henderson's Auto Repair, for instance. Family-owned business, been around for 20 years, probably has significant cash reserves. And that bakery downtown, Peterson's? No relation to you, I assume. Patterson's, I corrected. And no relation. Right, Patterson's Bakery. Small operations like that often have more assets than they know how to manage properly. We could help them diversify their holdings, maybe set up some retirement planning that would benefit everyone involved. They weren't just planning to defraud me. They were planning to use my client relationships to systematically target every small business owner I'd worked with over the past 30 years. This all sounds wonderful, I said, reaching for a pen. Where do I sign? But as I leaned forward to sign the first document, I deliberately knocked over my coffee cup, sending hot liquid spreading across the contract papers. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, I exclaimed, jumping up and grabbing napkins from the sidebar. I'm such a clumsy old fool. Don't worry about it, Trevor said, but I could see the irritation flash across his face. We have copies of everything. Let me help clean this up, I insisted, making a big show of dabbing at the soggy papers. I feel terrible about this. While I was fussing with the cleanup, I managed to slip one of the coffer-stained contracts into my purse. Physical evidence of their fraudulent partnership agreement would be crucial for the criminal case I was building. Really, Dorothy, it's fine, Richard Sterling said. We'll print new copies and schedule another meeting for later this week. Actually, I said, straightening up and looking directly at Trevor, I'm wondering if I could ask you gentlemen a question about something I overheard at the wedding reception. The room went very quiet. I heard one of you mention that if I didn't cooperate with this partnership, there might be other ways to handle the situation. I was wondering what you meant by that. Trevor's charming mask slipped completely for a moment, and I saw the cold predator underneath. I think you might have misheard something, Dorothy, he said carefully. Maybe, I said. But I could have sworn I heard someone mention that Cassie might become a very wealthy young widow if things didn't work out with her mother. Michael Voss stood up abruptly. I think this meeting is over. Is it? I asked, staying seated and looking at each of them in turn. Because I'm very interested in signing these contracts, gentlemen. I just want to make sure I understand all the terms, including what happens if I change my mind later. Richard Sterling was already gathering up the papers. We'll be in touch, Mrs. Peterson. Perhaps when you've had more time to think about what's at stake here. Oh, I understand exactly what's at stake, I said, finally standing up. The question is whether you do. As they ushered me toward the door, Trevor grabbed my arm just hard enough to make his point. Dorothy, I hope you understand that some opportunities don't come around twice. And some decisions can't be undone once they're made. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face. Trevor, I've been making difficult decisions for over 30 years. I think I can handle one more. I walked out of that office building knowing that I'd just declared war on 3 men who'd killed at least once before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. But I also walked out with recorded evidence of their fraud scheme, physical proof of their illegal contracts, and detailed admissions about their previous crimes. The trap was set. Now I just had to survive long enough to spring it. The 48 hours after that meeting were the longest of my life. I knew Trevor and his associates would be planning their next move, and I knew it wouldn't involve more polite business meetings and fake investment contracts. They'd seen enough of my questions and suspicions to know I wasn't going to be as easy to manipulate as they'd expected. And based on what Marcus had uncovered about Patricia Brennan's accident, I knew their solution to uncooperative targets was permanent. I'd given Marcus copies of the recording and the stolen contract immediately after leaving Trevor's office, but building a criminal case would take time we might not have. If Trevor's group decided I was too much of a risk to leave alive, they'd move quickly before I could expose their scheme. So I did something I'd never done before in 30 years of facing business challenges. I asked for help. My first call was to Sheriff Tom Bradley, who'd been elected to office 3 years earlier on a platform of protecting local businesses from fraud and white-collar crime. Tom had grown up in our town, and his mother had been one of my first bookkeeping clients back in the 1990s. "Mrs. Peterson, what can I do for you?" Tom asked when I arrived at his office that Wednesday morning. I handed him a folder containing copies of everything Marcus and I had compiled: Trevor's false credentials, the connections to fraud schemes in other states, the recording from our Monday meeting, and the contract with its predatory terms. "Sheriff, I believe my daughter's husband and his associates are planning to defraud me and possibly kill me to cover their tracks. I have evidence that they've done this before, and I need your help to stop them." Tom spent over an hour reviewing the materials, asking detailed questions about Trevor's background and the timeline of events since the wedding. "This is serious stuff, Mrs. Peterson," he finally said. "The problem is, most of this evidence is circumstantial. The recording is helpful, but they could claim it was just business discussion taken out of context. We'd need more concrete proof of criminal intent to make arrests stick." "What kind of proof?" "Ideally, we'd need to catch them in the act of attempting fraud or making specific threats. Or we'd need one of them to confess to their previous crimes on the record." I thought about that for a moment. What if I could get them to do exactly that? "Mrs. Peterson, I can't let you put yourself in danger trying to gather additional evidence. These people are potentially very dangerous. They're already planning to kill me, Sheriff. The question is whether we're going to let them do it on their timeline or ours." That afternoon, I made a phone call that I knew would put everything in motion. "Trevor," I said when he answered, "I've been thinking about our meeting on Monday, and I owe you an apology." "Do you?" His voice was carefully neutral. "I was rude and suspicious, and that wasn't fair to you or your partners. You're offering me an incredible opportunity, and I let my old-fashioned paranoia get in the way of good business sense." There was a long pause. "I'm glad to hear you say that, Dorothy. The truth is, I'm scared. I've been running my little business for so long that the thought of partnering with sophisticated investors like you makes me nervous. But I realize that's exactly why I need to do it." "Fear of change is natural at your age," Trevor said, and I could hear the condescension creeping back into his voice. "The important thing is that you're ready to move forward now." "I am. But I'd like to meet somewhere more private this time, where we can really discuss the details without interruption. Could you and your partners come to my house tomorrow evening? I'll make dinner, and we can handle all the paperwork in a more comfortable setting." Another pause. "That sounds very reasonable, Dorothy. What time would work for you?" "How about 7 o'clock? That should give us plenty of time to go through everything carefully." "Perfect. We'll see you tomorrow at 7. After I hung up, I called Sheriff Bradley. "They're coming to my house tomorrow night," I said. "Will that give you the opportunity you need to gather evidence?" "If we can get surveillance equipment set up properly, yes. But Mrs. Peterson, having them in your home puts you at significant personal risk." "Tom, they were going to kill me anyway. At least this way, we'll have them on record when they do it." That evening, I called Cassie. "Honey, I wanted you to know that Trevor and his business partners are coming over tomorrow night to finalize that investment deal." "Oh, Mom, that's wonderful." Cassie sounded genuinely excited. "Trevor said you seemed much more positive about the partnership after you had time to think about it." I realized he was right about a lot of things, I said, hating every word I was speaking. "I have been letting fear hold me back from opportunities. I'm so proud of you for being open to change. Trevor says that's the hardest thing for people your age. I mean, for people who've been set in their ways for a long time. People my age." Even my own daughter was echoing Trevor's dismissive attitude toward older adults. "Cassie, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy? Really happy, not just grateful or relieved to be married, but genuinely happy with Trevor?" There was a long pause before she answered. "Mom, Trevor has given me everything I never thought I could have. This beautiful house, financial security, a future I never could have built on a teacher's salary. I know he can seem a little intense sometimes, but he's just very focused on success." She didn't answer my question about being happy. "I just want you to know that if you ever need anything, if you ever feel unsafe or uncomfortable, you can always come home to me." "Mom, you're being dramatic. Trevor loves me. He's building a life for us that will last." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and cried for the first time since Frank's funeral 35 years earlier. Not for myself or the danger I was facing, but for my daughter who'd traded her independence and self-worth for the illusion of security with a man who saw her as nothing more than a useful tool. The next day, Sheriff Bradley's team spent hours setting up surveillance equipment throughout my house. Tiny cameras in the living room and kitchen, audio recording devices that would capture every word, and emergency communication systems that would allow the deputies stationed outside to respond immediately if things went wrong. "Remember," Tom told me as his team finished their preparations, "your job is just to get them talking. Don't try to confront them directly about the murders or the other fraud cases. Let them reveal information naturally through conversation. And if they try to hurt me, we'll be monitoring everything in real time. The moment you're in physical danger, we'll move in." As 7 o'clock approached, I found myself surprisingly calm. After weeks of fear and uncertainty, it was almost a relief to know that by the end of this evening, everything would be resolved one way or another. At exactly 7 o'clock, my doorbell rang. Trevor stood on my front porch with Richard Sterling and Michael Voss, all three men dressed in expensive suits and carrying briefcases like they were arriving for a legitimate business meeting. "Dorothy," Trevor said, leaning in to give me a kiss on the cheek like a loving son-in-law, "thank you so much for inviting us into your home. This is much more comfortable than that stuffy office." "Please, come in," I said, stepping aside to let them enter. "I've got coffee brewing, and I made a casserole for dinner." As they settled into my living room, looking around at my modest furniture and family photos, I realized they saw this as their victory lap. They thought they were here to collect their prize from a defeated old woman who'd finally accepted her fate. They had no idea they'd just walked into the most sophisticated trap of their criminal careers. "So," Richard Sterling said, opening his briefcase and pulling out fresh copies of the partnership contracts, "shall we get down to business?" "Absolutely," I said, settling into my favorite chair and smiling at the three men who'd planned to murder me. "Let's talk about exactly what kind of business you gentlemen are really in." What happened next in my living room that Thursday night was better than any revenge I could have planned, because I finally got to watch these three predators realize they'd been outplayed by the unretired failure they'd so casually dismissed. "Before we sign anything," I said, pouring coffee for my guests from my best china service, "I'd love to hear more about your success stories. Particularly that situation in Ohio you mentioned. Patricia Brennan, wasn't it?" Trevor accepted his coffee cup with a confident smile. "Patricia was a lovely woman, very similar to your situation. Small accounting practice, aging client base, needed guidance on modern business development. And she died in a car accident." "Very tragic," Michael Voss said, his dead eyes watching me carefully. "But these things happen, especially with older drivers who refuse to admit their reflexes aren't what they used to be." I nodded sympathetically. "I suppose at our age, we're all just one accident away from leaving everything to our children." "Exactly," Richard Sterling said. "Which is why it's so important to have proper business structures in place. Legal protections for the surviving family members." "Like Cassie, you mean?" Trevor leaned forward, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd come to despise. "Dorothy, Cassie would inherit your business if something happened to you, but she has no experience managing financial services clients. She'd be forced to liquidate everything at a fraction of its value, or sell to someone who might not have her best interests at heart." "But with our partnership agreement," Michael Voss added, "those assets would be protected in a professionally managed structure. Cassie would receive steady income without the burden of trying to run a business she doesn't understand." They were explaining their murder plan to me like it was a thoughtful estate planning service. "That's very considerate of you," I said. "I imagine Patricia Brennan's daughter benefited similarly when she inherited the accounting firm." "Oh yes," Trevor said, apparently forgetting his partner's earlier warnings about discussing specific cases. "Jennifer was able to liquidate the practice and invest the proceeds much more wisely than her mother ever could have. Last I heard, she was living very comfortably in Florida. With her husband, I assume." "Actually, no," Richard Sterling said before he could stop himself. "The marriage didn't work out. Sometimes these situations put stress on relationships." I knew exactly what kind of stress they meant. Once Jennifer Brennan's usefulness had ended and her mother's assets had been drained, Trevor, or whoever had played his role in Ohio, had disappeared, leaving her alone with whatever pieces remained of her life. "Well, I certainly hope Cassie has a happier outcome," I said, standing up to check on the casserole in the kitchen. She's so excited about your partnership with me. While I was in the kitchen, I could hear them talking quietly in the living room. Their voices were too low for me to make out specific words, but I could tell from their tone that they were discussing logistics, probably debating how long to wait after the contracts were signed before arranging my accident. When I returned with dinner, their mood had shifted. They were more focused, more businesslike. The predators were getting ready to close in on their prey. "This smells wonderful, Dorothy," Trevor said as I served the casserole. "Just like the kind of home-cooked meal Cassie's been trying to learn to make." "I've been teaching her my recipes," I said. "Family traditions should be passed down, don't you think?" "Absolutely. Speaking of family traditions, has Cassie mentioned that we're hoping to start a family soon?" My heart clenched. The thought of these monsters being responsible for raising my potential grandchildren made me physically sick. "She mentioned it," I said carefully. "I hope you'll both be very attentive parents." "Oh, I plan to be very involved in every aspect of my children's upbringing," Trevor said, and something in his voice made my skin crawl. "It's important to maintain control over all the influences in their lives." As we ate, they began asking more detailed questions about my business operations. Which clients had the most assets? Which ones were family-owned businesses that might be vulnerable to outside investment offers? Which owners were approaching retirement age and might be looking for exit strategies? I answered their questions honestly, because every word they spoke was being recorded, and every detail I revealed would help law enforcement understand the full scope of their scheme. "Henderson's Auto Repair is probably my most valuable client," I said. "Tom Henderson built that business over 25 years, and he's got substantial cash reserves plus valuable real estate. But he's 68 now, and his son isn't interested in taking over the business." "Interesting," Richard Sterling said, making notes in a small leather notebook. "Those are exactly the kind of transitional situations where our investment services can be most helpful." "What about Patterson's Bakery?" Michael Voss asked. "Mary Patterson is 72, and the bakery building is worth more than the business itself at this point. She's been talking about selling for years, but she's afraid of making the wrong decision about her retirement security." "We could help her with that," Trevor said confidently. "These older business owners need guidance on maximizing their asset values." They continued asking about client after client, building their target list right there at my dinner table. But with every question they asked and every answer I gave, they were also building the criminal case against themselves. After dinner, we moved back to the living room to review the partnership contracts. "Now, Dorothy," Richard Sterling said, spreading the papers across my coffee table, "this agreement will give us immediate access to your business accounts and client files. We'll need your banking information, all client contact details, and copies of financial records going back 5 years. "That seems like a lot of information to share with business partners I've just met," I said. "Trust is essential in any partnership," Trevor said smoothly. "Besides, we've already committed to a significant financial investment in your business. We need to protect that investment through proper oversight." "Of course," I said. "I suppose if I can't trust my own son-in-law, who can I trust?" Trevor's smile was sharp. "Exactly. Family should always come first." I picked up a pen and started reading through the contract one more time, pretending to consider each clause carefully. "This section about terminating the partnership," I said, pointing to a paragraph buried in the fine print. "It says you can dissolve the agreement at any time if I'm unable to fulfill my responsibilities due to incapacity or death." "What exactly does that mean?" "Just standard legal language," Michael Voss said quickly. "If you became seriously ill or, well, if something happened to you, we'd need a clear process for handling the business transition." "And this clause about assuming business debts and liabilities?" "Also standard," Richard Sterling said. "Any business partnership involves shared financial responsibility." But I'd read enough fraudulent contracts over the years to understand exactly what these clauses meant. Once I signed this agreement, they could load my business with fictitious debts, then claim my incapacity required them to take full control of all assets to satisfy those obligations. After my death, they'd liquidate everything, claim the proceeds were needed to cover the manufactured debts, and walk away with everything I'd built while leaving Cassie with nothing but liability for any remaining obligations. "Well," I said, setting down the pen and looking at each of them in turn, "this all seems very thorough. But I have to ask you gentlemen a direct question." The room went quiet. "Are you planning to kill me?" Trevor's charming mask finally slipped completely. Dorothy, what a strange thing to ask. Is it? Because I've been doing some research on your previous partnerships, and I've noticed a pattern. Patricia Brennan in Ohio, Rebecca Martinez in Arizona, Helen Chen in Nevada. All older women with successful small businesses, all of whom died in accidents within months of entering into partnership agreements with your group. Richard Sterling was already standing up. I think this meeting is over. Sit down, Richard, I said firmly. Because I'm not finished talking. Something in my voice made him pause. You see, gentlemen, I may be an unretired failure in your opinion, but I've spent 30 years learning how to investigate financial fraud. And when I started looking into your backgrounds, I found some very interesting information. I reached into the folder beside my chair and pulled out copies of everything Marcus had compiled. The credit reports, the property records, the connection to previous fraud cases, the evidence of Trevor's fabricated credentials. Trevor, you've never been to business school. Your family doesn't own any real estate development company. You've filed for bankruptcy twice, and you're currently the subject of multiple civil suits for unpaid debts. Trevor's face had gone completely white. Richard Sterling, if that's even your real name, you were investigated for securities fraud in 3 different states before you started working with Trevor. And Michael Voss, you're wanted for questioning in connection with the death of Rebecca Martinez in Arizona. Michael Voss was moving toward the door, but I wasn't finished. The best part is that everything you've said in my house tonight has been recorded. Every admission about Patricia Brennan, every detail about your targeting strategies, every plan you've made for liquidating my client's assets. That's when Trevor lunged toward me. But before he could reach my chair, my front door burst open and Sheriff Bradley entered with 4 deputies, their weapons drawn. Nobody move. Tom shouted. You're all under arrest. The next few minutes were chaos. Michael Voss tried to run out the back door but was tackled by deputies who'd been positioned in my yard. Richard Sterling attempted to destroy his notebook by throwing it into my fireplace, but one of the deputies retrieved it before any evidence was lost. Trevor just stood there in the middle of my living room, staring at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. You, he said, his voice shaking with fury. You set us up. I did, I said, standing up and smoothing down my skirt. Just like you set up Patricia Brennan and those other women. The difference is, I was smart enough not to underestimate my opponents. As the deputies handcuffed all 3 men, Sheriff Bradley approached me. Mrs. Peterson, we got everything we need. The recording equipment captured detailed confessions to multiple murders, clear evidence of fraud conspiracy, and specific threats against your life. These men are going to prison for a very long time. I looked at Trevor as the deputy read him his rights. You called me an unretired failure, I said. But the only failure here is yours. You failed to do proper research on your target. You failed to understand that some people fight back when you threaten their life's work. And most of all, you failed to recognize that this pathetic old woman has more experience with criminals like you than you could ever imagine. Trevor was still staring at me as they led him toward the door. This isn't over, he said. Cassie will never forgive you for destroying her marriage. Trevor, I said, Cassie deserves better than a husband who was planning to murder her mother. And now she'll have the chance to find it. As the police cars pulled away from my house, taking Trevor and his associates to jail, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. I'd won. The trap had worked perfectly, the evidence was overwhelming, and the men who'd planned to kill me would spend the rest of their lives in prison. But the hardest part still lay ahead, telling my daughter that her fairy-tale marriage had been built on lies, fraud, and murder. That conversation would have to wait until tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time in months, I was going to sleep peacefully in my own bed, knowing that this unretired failure had just proven that experience, determination, and careful planning could triumph over youth, arrogance, and criminal intent. Trevor Hoffman had learned the hard way that some women don't break when you try to destroy them. Some of us just get more dangerous. It's been 18 months since that night in my living room when I watched Trevor Hoffman and his associates get arrested for multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. As I sit here writing this story, I can see through my kitchen window to the small garden where I've been growing tomatoes and herbs, the same view I've had for over 30 years but with a perspective that's completely changed. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening. And if you've ever been dismissed because of your age, your gender, or your circumstances, I hope you'll remember what happened when 3 career criminals decided to underestimate a 71-year-old widow from a small town. The legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. With the recorded evidence from that final meeting, plus all the documentation Marcus and I had gathered about their previous crimes, the prosecution had an airtight case. Trevor, Richard Sterling, and Michael Voss all eventually accepted plea bargains rather than risk life sentences at trial. Trevor received 25 years to life for his role in Patricia Brennan's murder and the conspiracy to kill me. Richard Sterling got 20 years for fraud and accessory to murder. Michael Voss, who had been directly involved in Rebecca Martinez's death in Arizona, received life without parole. They'll all die in prison, which seems appropriate for men who made their living destroying other people's lives. The hardest part of this whole ordeal wasn't facing down 3 murderers in my living room. It was the conversation I had to have with Cassie the next morning. I'll never forget the look on her face when I explained what her husband had really been planning. The disbelief, the anger, the heartbreak of realizing that everything she thought she knew about her marriage had been a lie. "Mom, how could you not tell me?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "How could you let me believe I was happy when you knew he was planning to kill you?" "Because I needed to protect you," I said. "If Trevor had suspected you knew the truth, he might have hurt you too. And because..." I took a deep breath. "Because I needed you to be genuinely surprised by his arrest. Your reaction had to be authentic, or his lawyers might have claimed you were part of some elaborate setup." It took Cassie months to forgive me for keeping the truth from her, and even longer to forgive herself for being so thoroughly fooled by Trevor's act. But eventually, she came to understand that she hadn't been weak or naive. She'd been targeted by a professional predator who'd spent years perfecting his techniques. The annulment of her marriage was finalized within 6 months. The house in Westfield Estates was seized as evidence of criminal proceeds, along with Trevor's cars and most of their other possessions. Cassie moved back into her small apartment and returned to her teaching job, determined to rebuild her life on her own terms. She's dating someone new now, a fellow teacher named David who drives a 10-year-old Honda and lives in a modest duplex across town. When she talks about him, her voice has a warmth and contentment that was never there when she spoke about Trevor. She sounds like a woman who's choosing love rather than accepting rescue. As for Peterson Financial Services, I've actually expanded the business in ways Trevor never could have imagined. The publicity from his arrest, and the story of how a small-town bookkeeper took down a multi-state fraud ring, brought me more clients than I'd ever had. Business owners throughout the region want to work with someone who's proven she can spot financial predators and protect her clients from sophisticated scams. I'm busier now at 73 than I was at 50, but it's the kind of busy that comes from doing work you love with people you respect. I've hired 2 part-time assistants and moved into a proper office downtown, nothing fancy, but legitimate and professional. I've also become something of an accidental expert on elder fraud prevention. I speak at community centers, business organizations, and law enforcement conferences about how to recognize the warning signs of financial scams targeting older adults. The irony isn't lost on me that being called an unretired failure led to the most successful phase of my entire career. But the most important lesson I've learned from this experience isn't about business or crime prevention or even revenge. It's about the power of refusing to accept someone else's definition of your worth. When Trevor Hoffman stood in that country club ballroom and dismissed me as an unretired failure, he wasn't just insulting me personally. He was expressing a worldview that sees older women as disposable, irrelevant, easily manipulated. He assumed that because I was past traditional retirement age and running a small business rather than a corporate empire, I must be weak, desperate, and grateful for any attention from a younger, supposedly more successful man. That assumption cost him everything. I've spent my entire adult life proving that success isn't measured by the size of your bank account or the prestige of your title or the opinions of people who don't understand the value of honest work. Success is measured by the lives you touch, the problems you solve, the people you help, and the legacy you leave behind. Peterson Financial Services may never make me rich, but it's helped dozens of families build financial security, navigate difficult transitions, and achieve dreams they thought were impossible. That's not failure by any reasonable measure. That's a life well lived. To anyone watching this who's ever been told they're too old, too small, too insignificant to matter, remember that predators target people they perceive as weak. But sometimes, what looks like weakness is actually experience, wisdom, and the kind of quiet strength that comes from surviving every challenge life has thrown at you. Trevor Hoffman learned too late that this unretired failure had more fight left in her than he could have possibly imagined. And if someone tries to tell you that your best days are behind you, that you should be grateful for whatever scraps they're willing to throw your way, that you're too old or too small or too unimportant to stand up for yourself, well, you just remember what happened to the last person who made that mistake with me. Before you go, please subscribe to this channel if this story resonated with you, and share it with anyone who needs to hear that it's never too late to fight back against people who try to diminish your worth. Comment below and tell me about a time when someone underestimated you. I read every single comment, and I love hearing your stories. Remember, you're never too old to learn something new, never too small to make a difference, and never too insignificant to defend what matters to you. Some of us just get more dangerous with age. And that's exactly as it should be.